The morning sun gently filtered through the maple trees that were beginning to show their fall colors on Maple Street. In Newton's upscale residential area, residents could be seen enjoying their early morning jogs. Among the row of brick mansions, one white building particularly caught the eye. Inside, Melissa Wilson was busy preparing breakfast as usual. "Thomas, pancakes are ready." At her call from the kitchen, footsteps echoed from the second floor. Her 12-year-old son Thomas descended the stairs with an almost adult-like bearing. His river school uniform looked distinguished in the afternoon light. "Mom, I have a math test today." "Yes, you were studying late last night." Melissa watched her son's profile as she set down a plate of pancakes drowned in maple syrup. It had been 3 years since her divorce. She had raised her son while working desperately as a single mother. Now she was successful as a high-end real estate agent, and Thomas was achieving excellent grades at the private Rivers school. On weekends, her ex-husband Michael would come to pick up their son. They maintained a good relationship with him even after the divorce. If anything, they seemed to understand each other better since separating. After finishing breakfast, Thomas stood by the large living room window, gazing outside. It was his usual habit while waiting for the school bus. But this morning, he seemed lost in thought. "Oh, are you going to Grandma's house at 4 o'clock today too?" "Yes, same as always." Thomas's expression suggested he wanted to say something, but he quickly returned to a smile. Although Melissa sensed something odd about her son's behavior, she didn't pursue it further. "Is Grandpa Richard nice?" "Well." Melissa's response was vague. A year ago, her mother Elizabeth had married Richard Stanford, an investor. The wedding, held at the Chestnut Hill Country Club, was so lavish it made the local papers. At the time, Melissa had felt uneasy about their meeting. Richard, whom her mother said she'd met at bridge club, gave the impression of being rather calculating. However, seeing her mother's radiant expression had dispelled those doubts. She'd been worried about her mother's recent behavior. During their weekly visits, she sometimes seemed to want to say something. Her mother, who had assets worth $5 million, appeared to maintain her elegant lifestyle even after marriage. But their phone conversations had gradually grown shorter, and there was something dark in her tone of voice. After marrying Richard, Elizabeth had reduced her participation in charity events. She'd stopped attending Sunday services at the Episcopal Church, and her beloved backyard garden had become neglected. "Mom, it's time for the bus." Thomas's voice brought her back to reality. Her son was already wearing his backpack, checking the time on the smartwatch his father had given him. The device was equipped with the latest features. Michael had chosen a high-end model with GPS and emergency contact functions, thinking of his son's safety. "Yes, have a good day." After seeing her son off, Melissa began preparing for work. Today she had an open house at a luxury apartment in Brookline. She couldn't afford to slack off if she wanted to maintain her position as top sales agent at Coldwell Banker. She put on her pearl necklace and picked up her Range Rover keys. She checked her reflection in the mirror. There were slight signs of fatigue under her eyes. Still, pride in balancing work and childcare kept her spine straight. Outside the window, the autumn wind rustled through the red-tinged trees. It was a peaceful morning scene. However, no one could have imagined that this day would dramatically change the lives of Melissa and her family. Before leaving the house, Melissa glanced at the shelf where her mother's photograph was displayed. A smiling photo from the wedding. Next to it was an image of her mother in her younger years, wearing the antique pearl necklace inherited from her grandparents. Although both photos showed happy expressions, she felt an inexplicable tightness in her chest. Friday afternoon. Thomas was working on his math homework at Michael's house. He had come here after school to spend the weekend at his father's place. On the old desk lay an open mathematics textbook, with his father's photograph beside it. The picture of him in his police uniform always gave Thomas a sense of security. However, today, even that photo couldn't calm his heart. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the window illuminated the textbook on the desk. The shadows of autumn-colored trees swayed quietly in the room. However, Thomas's mind had completely drifted away from solving problems. The time for his mother to visit his grandmother's house was approaching. Every Friday at 4 p.m. That had been a long-standing promise between mother and daughter. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed his mother's expression growing darker with each visit to his grandmother's house. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a door opening downstairs. Thomas instinctively straightened his back. An unfamiliar man's voice was talking with Richard. The voices were kept low, but he could hear them if he went halfway down the stairs. He checked his smartwatch screen. 12 minutes until his mother's departure time. He remembered his father's words, "If something feels wrong, secure evidence first." As Thomas carefully began descending the stairs, he turned on his smartwatch's recording function. "We'll set it up before Melissa arrives. Are the brakes okay? Did you dispose of all the tools? Don't worry. Everything's perfect. The $5 million will be ours." Thomas's spine froze. Richard's voice had a coldness he'd never heard before. His true nature was seeping through the voice of the man who had been pretending to be an elegant gentleman. "What about Elizabeth? She's drugged and sleeping. Can't let her meet her daughter. She'll be sound asleep in the second-floor bedroom by now. The insurance money. Like the previous 2 cases. All arranged. If we make it look like an accident, no one will suspect anything. The insurance money and assets will all be mine. But what about that son? You mean Thomas? He's studying upstairs right now. He's a quiet kid. Hasn't noticed anything." At Richard's words, Thomas caught his breath. His heart was racing. His mother was in danger. His grandmother was in a dangerous situation too. But what should he do? His father was on duty and couldn't answer the phone. Even if he called the police, they might not come immediately. Time was running out. The words, "previous 2 cases," echoed in his head. Had there been other victims? Had everything been a planned crime? Thomas dialed his mother's cell phone number with trembling hands. His mother would surely answer. She would understand the emergency from his tone of voice. "Hello, Thomas." His mother's voice rang out. Her usual gentle voice. "Mom, don't get in the car. Run." "What's wrong? Calm down and tell me." Grandpa Richards." Footsteps coming up the stairs. Thomas hurriedly hung up and hid in the closet. He squeezed himself between large pieces of clothing. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. In the darkness, the scent of his father's uniform touched his nose. At the same time, Melissa had started her car. Although worried about the strange call from her son, she had to go to her mother's house. She had been concerned about her mother's recent behavior, and now this. The dashboard clock was about to strike 4 o'clock. She drove the usual route. However, something was different today. The air felt heavy. The setting sun reflected in the rearview mirror had an ominous red tint. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. As she approached a curve and pressed the brake pedal, it sank all the way to the floor. What? In a panic, she pulled the handbrake, but it didn't work. The car accelerated toward a tree ahead. Red autumn leaves covered the windshield, tinting her view completely red. With a violent impact, everything went dark. In the closet, Thomas clutched his smartwatch to his chest. The recording continued. He remembered his father's words, "Preserve evidence. And never give up." The cold metal sensation remained in his sweaty palm. Outside, the sound of a car crash echoed in the distance, and the footsteps of Richard and the unknown man could be heard rushing downstairs. Thomas tried to dial his mother's number again with trembling hands, but the signal was already gone. In the darkness, the boy closed his eyes as if in prayer. In the intensive care unit of Massachusetts General Hospital, Melissa slowly opened her eyes in a white room filled with the scent of disinfectant. Her head felt heavy, and her vision was blurry. The regular dripping sound of an 4 echoed in the distance. "Mom." A faint voice could be heard. As she focused her eyes, she saw Thomas standing by her bedside. Tears glistened in the eyes of the usually dignified boy. "Thomas, are you all right?" When she asked in a hoarse voice, her son shook his head. "Mom, I know everything." Thomas took out his smartwatch with trembling hands. The evidence was saved in the recording data. The decisive voice recording that would expose Richard's conspiracy lay sleeping in this small device. "Dr. Carter has arrived." Following the nurse's voice, a middle-aged doctor in a white coat entered the room. His deeply lined face showed signs of fatigue. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm glad you've regained consciousness. About the CT scan results." The doctor's explanation was technical and difficult, but essentially, it meant that Melissa had miraculously avoided serious injury. Thanks to the seatbelt and the new car's safety features. "The police are here." The nurse spoke again. The person who entered was Detective John Murphy, Michael's colleague. Behind his mild expression, sharp eyes gleamed. The veteran detective with 20 years of experience had immediately noticed traces of an unusual accident. "Thomas, would you let me hear the recording?" Detective Murphy spoke gently. Thomas trusted the detective who was his father's colleague. When he played the smartwatch data, cold conversations began flowing through the hospital room. "This is..." Detective Murphy's expression grew stern. "Richard Stanford, we need to thoroughly investigate this Richard's background." At that moment, noisy voices could be heard from the hallway. "Let me see my daughter. She's my daughter." It was Richard's voice. However, the sound of security guards stopping him could be heard immediately. Detective Murphy stood up and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You did really well. This recording will be crucial evidence." A nurse rushed in. "Elizabeth has been found." Everyone's attention focused on the nurse. At her home in Chestnut Hill, in a very weakened state. Melissa tried to sit up but was prevented by a severe headache. Thomas held his mother's hand. "It's okay, Mom. You're safe now." At that moment, there was another commotion in the hallway. This time, it was Michael's voice. "Get out of my way. What did you do to my family?" The sound of a scuffle echoed, followed by security guards rushing to the scene. Amidst the chaos, Detective Murphy left the room. Thomas gripped his mother's hand even tighter. Outside the window, the autumn sun was setting red. Street lights began to light up one by one. "My mother?" Melissa asked worriedly. "Grandma is being treated in another room. The doctor said she was drugged and put to sleep." Thomas played the rest of the recording. It contained conversations between Richard and another man. The fact that they had drugged and confined Elizabeth. The plan to make Melissa's death look like an accident and obtain the insurance money and inheritance. And the shocking fact that this wasn't their first crime. Just like the previous two cases. Richard's voice echoed coldly. "Mr. Murphy, this is..." Thomas began with a trembling voice. "Yes, it might be connected to unsolved cases we've been pursuing. Suspicious deaths of wealthy widows 2 and 4 years ago." Detective Murphy pulled out old newspaper clippings from his pocket. The headline read, "Wealthy Widow Dies in Traffic Accident." Richard Stanford, no, Richard Connors. He's the marriage fraudster we've been chasing for years. But we never had decisive evidence. Thomas remembered his father's words. Preserve evidence. And never give up. His father's teaching had now saved their family. At that moment, the commotion in the hallway subsided. Michael entered the room. His uniform was disheveled, and anger remained on his face. However, his expression softened instantly upon seeing his family. "Melissa, Thomas. I'm so glad you're safe." Michael embraced his son. Large tears fell from Thomas's eyes. "Dad. I kept the evidence properly." "Yes, you did very well. You're a brave and wise boy." Detective Murphy quietly left the room. The sound of Richard being taken away could be heard in the hallway. Cries of "I have rights" escaped from his mouth. Outside the window, it had become completely dark. The streetlights cast a gentle light into the hospital room. Melissa looked at the sky visible from her bed. "Thomas, if you hadn't called." "Mom, it's okay now. We'll all protect Grandma from now on." There was no more hesitation in Thomas's voice. The 12-year-old boy had certainly grown up a size larger that day. "Mrs. Elizabeth has regained consciousness," the nurse announced softly. "She's asking to see you." Melissa nodded to the nurse. Still attached to her fore, she headed to her mother's room in a wheelchair. Thomas wouldn't let go of his mother's hand. "Let's go. To see Mother." Strength had returned to Melissa's voice. Thomas pushed his mother's wheelchair, with Michael accompanying them. When they opened the hospital room door, Elizabeth lay there. Her former elegant beauty had faded, transformed into an emaciated figure. However, when she saw her daughter, light returned to her eyes. "Melissa." "Thomas." Tears overflowed from Elizabeth's eyes. "Mother." Melissa couldn't hold back her tears either. At that moment, Detective Murphy entered the room. In his hands, he held a plastic bag containing evidence. "If you're able to talk, could you tell us about Richard Connors?" Elizabeth gave a small nod. And so her testimony began. It all started a year ago with their meeting at the bridge club. He was such a gentleman and so kind at first. Elizabeth began speaking in a trembling voice. The wedding at Chestnut Hill Country Club. The first few months were like a dream. However, right after signing the marriage certificate, Richard's attitude began to change. He started pressuring me to transfer my assets to his name. When I refused, he began drugging me. The room fell silent at Elizabeth's confession. Thomas gently held his grandmother's thin hand. "Melissa, that man was trying to kill you." Her mother's voice trembled. "But this child." Thomas did everything. At that moment, a loud noise echoed in the hallway. Detective Murphy quickly stood up. However, at that instant, the hospital room door burst open. There stood Richard, his handcuffs removed. His graying hair was disheveled, his expensive suit in disarray. In his eyes dwelt an unfathomable madness. "Because of you all, everything is ruined." Richard pulled out a small syringe from his pocket. Richard slowly approached Melissa. "The $5 million was almost mine." "Stop!" Elizabeth screamed. "If it's about money, I'll give you everything." "Shut up!" Richard's shout echoed through the room. "It's too late, everything's ruined, at least, this woman." At that moment, something unexpected happened. Thomas stood in front of his mother's wheelchair. "Thomas! It's dangerous!" Melissa screamed. But the boy didn't move. He held up his smartwatch and played the recording. "You'll just be adding more evidence." Thomas's voice was surprisingly calm. Richard's hand stopped. His own voice began playing in the hospital room. Just like the previous two cases, confining Elizabeth, making Melissa's death look like an accident. That. Richard's face turned pale. Taking advantage of that moment, Detective Murphy grabbed him from behind. The syringe fell to the floor, rolling with a clatter. Richard Connors, you're under arrest for attempted murder, confinement, and fraud. Michael also rushed in and restrained Richard. The sound of backup officers arriving could be heard from the hallway. The Jane Foster case from 2 years ago, the Mary Williams case from 4 years ago, they were all your doing, weren't they? Detective Murphy's voice echoed coldly. Evidence? There's nothing. Richard tried to resist. It's right here. Thomas held up his smartwatch. Everything is recorded. A child's device. Richard's voice filled with despair. I had the perfect plan. It was a good plan, Detective Murphy said. But you overlooked one thing. Family bonds. The strength drained from Richard's body. In the hallway, the sound of FBI agents arriving could be heard. It was the moment when a serial killer who had been pursued for years was finally arrested. Mother. Thomas. Melissa's voice trembled. Elizabeth tried to sit up in bed. A nurse hurried to support her. Melissa, I'm sorry. I couldn't see through him. No, Mother. You were a victim. Thomas silently watched the two of them. Outside the window, dawn's light was gradually beginning to color the sky. The subsequent developments were surprisingly swift. Through the FBI's investigation, Richard Connors' past was revealed one after another. His real name was Richard James Connors. He was a man who had been repeatedly committing marriage fraud targeting wealthy widows for over 20 years. 5 aliases, 7 suspicious deaths, and countless fraud cases. All the evidence was connected through Thomas's recorded data. Your father would be proud of you, son, Detective Murphy patted Thomas's shoulder. The morning sun streaming through the hospital room window announced the beginning of a new day. Melissa looked at her mother and son. Family bonds that were wounded but never broken. They possessed the strength to overcome any crisis. Thomas, the grandmother called to her grandson. Come here. As Thomas approached, Elizabeth took out a small box. This was passed down from my mother. I want to entrust it to you. Inside the box was an antique pocket watch. It's different from your smartwatch, but this watch carries our family's history. Thomas carefully received the watch. In it lived the undeniable bonds of family, continuing from past to future. 1 year later in autumn. In their new home in Newton, Melissa was gazing at the morning sun streaming through the window. Half a year had passed since moving, and finally, a settled life had returned. In the garden, maple trees with autumn colors spread vibrantly, and the dew-covered lawn sparkled. Mom, are you ready? Thomas came down the stairs. Her 13-year-old son had grown even taller, and his expression was more adult-like than ever. In his school uniform, the student council president badge gleamed on his chest. Yes, let's go. Today was a special day. It was the day when the verdict would be handed down for Richard Connors, alias Richard Stanford. Melissa, Thomas, let's go. Michael was waiting at the entrance. He had just been promoted at the police station in recognition of his achievements. However, today he was attending court as family. Elizabeth also lived in the new house. Since the incident, the mother-daughter bond had deepened further. Now, watching her mother enjoy gardening in the yard every morning had become a daily routine. She was gradually recovering from the effects of the drugs and regaining her former elegant beauty. Have a safe trip. Elizabeth stood at the entrance to see them off. The scent of roses from the garden wafted in the morning air. Michael's car set off toward the Boston courthouse under the clear autumn sky. In the car, Thomas was staring at his smartwatch. Its screen flickered with a display showing 1 year since the incident. Nervous? Melissa asked her son. No, but it's my first time seeing that man. When they arrived at the courthouse, many reporters had already gathered. Marriage fraud killer finally sentenced, 12-year-old boy's courage solves case. All the newspapers were covering this case extensively. Thomas Wilson. Reporters pointed their cameras at him. Comment on your brave actions. However, Michael shielded his son from the press. Today, we'd like to quietly observe the sentencing. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. In front were the families of Richard's previous victims. Expressions of sadness and anger. And relief that the truth would finally be revealed. Defendant, Richard James Connors. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom. Richard in the defendant's seat had aged considerably. No trace remained of his former gentlemanly appearance. This court hereby delivers the following verdict to the defendant. Silence dominated the courtroom. For 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of fraud, the defendant is sentenced to life imprisonment. The sound of the gavel echoed, finalizing the sentence. It was the moment when a nightmare that had lasted over 20 years finally came to an end. As Richard was being led away, his gaze briefly met Thomas's. However, the boy didn't flinch, staring straight back. In his eyes shone the dignified light of one who had upheld justice. Outside the courtroom, Detective Murphy was waiting. It's finally over. Yes, at last. Melissa let out a deep sigh. At that moment, a woman approached them. She was the daughter of Mary Williams, who had lost her husband 4 years ago. Thomas, thank you, she said with tears in her eyes. Thanks to your courage, the truth about my mother's death was revealed. Other victims' families also came over. Each expressed their gratitude to Thomas. The boy just nodded quietly. On the way home, the car drove along the autumn-colored Charles River. Dad, Thomas spoke up. I've decided what I want to be. Oh. What's that? Michael looked at his son through the rearview mirror. A police officer? No, an FBI agent. I see. Michael smiled. You'll surely become an excellent investigator. When they returned home, Elizabeth was waiting with warm tea prepared. In the living room, Fox News was broadcasting a special report about the case. From today, our new life truly begins, Elizabeth said. On the table, family photos were arranged. A photo of Elizabeth and Melissa before the marriage. A picture of young Thomas with Michael. And a recent photo of the entire family. Happy smiles shone within the frames. Hey, everyone! Melissa called out. Shall we go for a picnic next Sunday? That sounds lovely. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled. Chestnut Hill Park is most beautiful this season. I'll help make the lunch boxes, Thomas said excitedly. Michael sat on the sofa, gently watching this scene. Though divorced, they had become good understanding partners, watching over their son's growth together. That night, Thomas was polishing the pocket watch his grandmother had given him. When placed next to his smartwatch, it created an interesting contrast. The latest technology and tradition passed down through generations. Both had become important protectors of this family. Outside the window, the full moon quietly illuminated the sky. The sound of maple leaves rustling in the night breeze could be heard. Thomas, it's bedtime, Melissa called out. Okay, oh, Mom. What is it? Can we all have breakfast together tomorrow too? Melissa smiled. Of course. From now on, we'll always be together. Thomas nodded contentedly. On his desk were stacked reference books about becoming a police officer. Next to them was a photo of his father in uniform. In the boy's eyes shone hope for a bright future. A new morning was about to dawn on the family once again.